r/askreddit. Waiters, waitresses, what is the worst first date you've witnessed? Couple years ago, I was tending bar at a high-end steak joint. A pretty brunette walked in and sat down at the bar. After fixing her a cocktail, I asked if she'd like to see a dinner menu. She explained that she was waiting for a date. A few moments later, the guy arrived carrying a large bag. It was immediately obvious this date was their first. Their conversation was lurching from forced to downright painful when he reached into the bag and pulled out an album containing his Pokemon card collection. He set the book on the bar and thumbed through each page, thoroughly and lovingly describing every card, attempting to educate his date in the ways of Japanese pocket monsters. I'll be fair to the guy, dude was passionate. She feigned an emergency and called her friend to pick her up. He stayed and ate a plain hamburger at the bar. Edit. Both of these people were in their mid-30s. If showing a girl your holographic Charizard card doesn't get you laid, then I don't know what will. A little more charm and their pants would have come off. Edit. Thanks for the gym badge. I'm a girl who actually likes Pokemon well enough. I had the cards when I was a kid. I have a few of the Game Boy games still as an adult. I would have fucking fled too. This shows a total lack of social awareness. This isn't as bad as some of the others, but the guy and girl arrived separately and it seemed like they were meeting for the first time at the restaurant. They sat down, then the girl excused herself and went to the bathroom. The guy ordered drinks for them both while she was gone, then, after like 30 minutes, ordered 2 meals. It was so obvious she wasn't coming back, but he kept calling her and eventually just left all the food and drink untouched and paid the bill. This is heartbreaking. After like 30 minutes, ordered 2 meals. My heart physically hurt when the story got to that line. At that point, it's either bewildering denial or insanity. I would totally eat both dinners. Bartended for a decade. For a while I was at a medium-range Italian restaurant. More than once I saw a first date go awry because one of the two drank too much. Most memorable was a woman who started downing rum punches. They were at a table so I couldn't see them, and I guess the waiter had forgotten his red light, yellow light training. I don't know if they still do that. After the 6th one I asked if these were all going to the same person and he said yes. I was like, oh shit. Sure enough, girl ended up puking all over my bathroom and locking herself in. When we got the door open she was passed out and there was puke everywhere, including all over her. No cab would touch her, so the guy ended up taking her home. He came in a week later and said they were going on another date. I was skeptical. They've been married for about 15 years and are absurdly happy. She avoids rum punches. That's oddly wholesome. Except for all the puke, of course. Oh man, thanks for asking this one. I've got a great one. Happened at my former restaurant. Reservation for 6 o'clock. Young guy comes in a few minutes early. Tells me he's kind of nervous because it's a first date and he hasn't had many before. Blah blah blah. Kind of sweet really. Anyways, girl arrives about half an hour late and proceeds to get very, very drunk. About midway through the meal, she answers her phone, takes the call, and starts talking about her date in front of her date, saying stuff like, well, he's not usually my type, I don't exactly like him, but I felt like why not, right in front of him. Young man looks so discouraged, walks up to me, pays his bill, and leaves. He's a really nice guy. He's come to the place I work at now a few times. Seems like the kind of situation where it'd be perfectly reasonable for him to leave her with the tab. I work at a pretty high-end steakhouse. I got sat with a table of 2 and when I greeted them, I assumed they were a couple. It took them quite a while to order their food. I had to go back quite a few times and ask if they were ready. After an hour of them talking, ordering cocktails, and looking at the menu, they finally ordered. The woman ordered a filet mignon and the guy ordered our most expensive steak. Right before their food came out, I saw the guy get up and walk towards the bathroom. My co-workers ran their food to their table and the woman sat there with all the food in front of her. I thought he was coming back soon, but around 20 minutes went by and there was no sign of him. My manager walked over to me and asked me what was up with them. I said the guy was in the bathroom. My manager went and asked her if she wanted us to keep the food under the warmer. She said yes, and the food was under the warmer for maybe an hour while she sat at the table alone. I walked over to her and asked if everything was alright. She immediately broke down, said it was their first date and that they met on Tinder. Apparently she told him that a steakhouse was a little much for a first date and suggested coffee instead, but he said no. As they were sitting there talking, he looked at his phone and said my daughter has an emergency, and he quickly got up and left. She was texting him after and he never replied. This girl bawled to me for 20 minutes, repeatedly saying what's wrong with me, and I had to reassure her he doesn't know what he is missing, blah blah. I went over to my manager and asked what we should do about the check. He said he was stuck because it was a $250 tab and that's too much to just not have her pay. After a few minutes of convincing him, I got him to take everything off the bill. I boxed up all the food, including his steak and sides, brought it over to her and told her to enjoy her night. She stopped crying, thanked me, and left. After writing this, I'm now wondering if they swindled me. Would have been a hell of a ploy all for some good meat. Steak that's been under a heat lamp for an hour isn't gonna be that great though. They'd have enjoyed their evening and food more if they'd stayed to eat and then found a hair in it 3/4 through the plate. He reached for his water and punched it directly into her lap. That's one way to make a girl wet. During my first date with my now boyfriend, he reached across the table and hit a ceramic mug which flew off the table and shattered onto my unsuspecting toes. I was picking ceramic shards out of my foot for the rest of the day. There was this young guy eating dinner with his mom. I noticed they seemed weirdly uncomfortable and distant but didn't think much of it. Turns out the lady was not his mom. He had met her on a dating site and had been very clearly catfished. The lady was at least a good 20 years older than him. When she left the restaurant, he stayed behind and told me about what happened, then asked me out. I politely declined but agreed with him that was a really weird situation. This actually happened to me. Expected to meet a girl at the restaurant who was around my age at the time, 27, but it was a woman closer to 50. She was my age when I was born. We had nothing in common and pretty sure she was using her daughter's pictures on her profile. Witnessed a CPL on their first date having a few drinks. Started making out by the third. Dude cried by the fourth. Started sucking on her finger. Cried again. Abruptly ran out of the bar and down the street. She paid. Came back 2 weeks later. I pretended not to recognize him to be nice, and he brought it up. I think you served me on a date 2 weeks ago. I dunno man, I serve a lot of people. Yeah, it was you, remember? I cried and ran away, bruh. Yeah, it was you, remember? I cried and ran away. I can't tell if this is a power move. Bruh. I was hanging out at Starbucks and witnessed a horrible date. She was Japanese and he started off by showing her his shirt with sumo wrestlers on it, then would ask questions like, "What's your favorite sushi? Do you only speak Japanese? How do you say toilet in Japanese? They have sumo in Japan, right? Did you see my shirt?" It was so amazingly awkward I bought another cup of coffee to listen to the entire thing. It was so amazingly awkward I bought another cup of coffee. Is that the Starbucks version of getting your popcorn so you can sit back and watch? I have no idea if they were on a date or been married for too long, but this. We had our flight cancelled due to a snowstorm on Christmas Eve. The only place open for dinner was an Indian restaurant. There were a few customers in there. It was an interesting looking bunch, sort of what you'd expect eating out on Christmas Eve. This one couple though looked to be in their 40s. A guy and a woman. She never said a word and looked like she was in a trance. The guy though kept talking at her in this slow monotone. "And another thing I hate about you," and proceeded to critique her while she continued to stare into space. She never said a word and looked like she was in a trance. The guy though kept talking at her in this slow monotone. "And another thing I hate about you," and proceeded to critique her while she continued to stare into space. Sounds like a long-term abusive relationship. At some point she mentally checked out because she's heard it all before. Hope she eventually ditched him. I'm not service staff, but I often eat drink alone and people watch, and first dates are almost always painfully obvious. Worst one I ever saw. Two people who were probably perfect for each other, they were both completely self-absorbed. How completely? They both started stories and kept telling them at the same time. They weren't even listening, just talking at each other. I was enraptured by the sheer insanity of it. I didn't eat for like 45 minutes as they both just yapped away, barely stopping. I'm a bartender at Popular Burger and Wine Bar. I had an older gentleman, about 60 years old, come in on a Wednesday evening and order a bottle of wine and 2 glasses as he's waiting for someone to show. This other older woman shows up a short while later and both of them hit it off. They sat themselves right behind my post, so basically anytime I had to ring something in I had a front row seat to their date. Both of them crush 3 bottles of wine and sit there for about 4 hours talking away. Around the 4th hour of them sitting they both started making out randomly and will not stop. They started sucking faces with an uncomfortable intensity, somewhat terrifying all my bar guests and myself. At one point the older fella leaves for the bathroom and his date proceeds to let me know it's their first time meeting. Not entirely the worst first date for them I suppose, but definitely was for me and the other customers. I've shared this story before, but I once had 2 very young, like 15 at most, teenage boys come into my place for what was clearly their first date together, if not their first date ever. Maybe 20 minutes into their date one of their mothers showed up, realized it was a boy her son was on a date with, and started screaming and crying about she didn't understand how he could do this to her and didn't he know she wanted grandchildren, etc, etc. Just flipped out and was totally homophobic and told him he wasn't allowed in her home if he was going to choose this lifestyle. He started crying, his poor date was totally bewildered, and ended up calling his mom to come take them home. This hurts my heart. I don't understand people. I once saw a guy try and impress his date by pretending to know about wine. He then proceeded to pronounce every single wrong one. I don't even know how I would phonetically write out his butchering of Chablis and Sauvignon Blanc. Date looked at him like he'd just taken a shit on the table. Girl and guy came into the barbecue restaurant I worked at. They met at the door exchanging the usual hi, nice to meet you, etc. The guy was a complete dick. She ordered ribs and he said, do you want to keep that hot figure of yours or look like that chick over there? Points to slightly overweight woman. Then, when they were waiting to pay he starts flirting with the chick behind them. She deadass waited until he paid then left without waiting for the food. Not a waiter but me and my GF sat next to an obvious first date at a Pan-Asian fusion restaurant, Zen in Durham, UK. She comments that her main course wasn't quite what she expected and thought it'd be spicier. He then snaps his fingers above his head very loudly so half the restaurant turns round to look and a waitress rolls her eyes and goes over. He demands that they cook IT again and make IT hotter. Next thing, there's half a dozen Thai waitresses around the table calling him worse than shit in Thai. My Thai GF translated, causing a massive scene while her face turns red and they take her plate away. She then has to sit with no food while he continues eating. He eventually realizes he's fucked up and stops eating, but she sarcastically tells him to enjoy his food. They brought her a fresh plate and they eat in silence. First and I'm sure the last date. I served at a table where the woman looked frightened and had a body language like she's leaning away from the guy while gathered tight. My coworkers would ask me if she's okay after they passed through my section. The guy was sitting and leaning over the table, looked like he was invading her space. Angry looking guy. He talked to her like she was a dog that just pissed on the rug. When he went to the bathroom I asked if she's okay and she said yes. I doubt he got a second date though. I'm a host at a restaurant, but my first week working a gay couple got in a fight in the middle of their meal, drawing attention from everyone in the restaurant. Before my manager could step in and stop it, one stood up and shouted, "You're the reason most people are straight," and left. I've always thought about how it is both a roast or compliment depending on sexuality. I was on a first date and we were comparing extracurricular activities. He was in a bowling league and played softball. I was on a dart league and played volleyball. We were talking about darts and whether it wasn't an activity that demanded some sort of skill over luck. I felt a bit insulted by his patronizing attitude, and before our food even came we started to argue across the rather large booth where we sat. He said, "Fine, since you're so SKR, I'll let at darts. See if you can get an ice cube into my mouth from there," and I said, "Fine, open up." He opened his mouth, and I launched an ice cube straight into the back of his throat. His eyes bugged, he clamped his mouth shut, grabbed his throat, and fell over in the seat. This waitress that had been standing nearby, shaking her head at our stupid argument, ran over to help when he sat up, threw the ice cube onto the table, yelled, "Fuck you," and stomped out. I said that I was really sorry, that I didn't mean to get it into his throat, blah blah, but he kept on stomping and I never saw him again. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. Edit. Listen, I wasn't ever that great of a dart player, but whipping ice at some clown across a table is a lot closer than shooting a dart almost 8 feet toward a dartboard. That said, it was a complete accident. It all happened so fast that it took me a moment to realize what was going on, mostly when the waitress came rushing over. We were all pretty surprised, and I sincerely tried to apologize, but the trauma was done. After he left, the waitress laughed her ass off, which made me laugh a little, but I didn't actually laugh about it until I told my friends later that night. Also, I paid for dinner. Edit. Thank you for silver. Girl was obviously super into guy, and he seemed like he was at least somewhat interested. They both talked and joked with me. Overall great table. Cut to the check. I ask if it will be together, and the girl smiles at the guy. He promptly says, "No, separate please." Her face dropped, and he blatantly wrote his number on the check with a little note for me. That poor girl almost cried as she quietly shuffled out the door. What an ass he was. This probably doesn't compare to some of these freak show stories, but I'll tell it anyways. I worked for IHOP for a very long 3 months. Most of my experiences were decent. On one occasion, one of my acquaintances came in with a date. We had been friends as kids and still sometimes chatted amicably. At this time, I had a stutter that would happen if I spoke too quickly, was stressed, or just trying to speak hard words. I went up to their table, said hi to my friend and her date, and instantly flubbed the greeting with a stutter. Honestly, my stutter has never bothered me, never felt like a bad thing until that moment. Her date looked at me, did that little condescending laugh that we've all heard before, and then repeated what I said while mocking my stutter. I could see my friend physically recoil from him, her face clearing, showing a "did you really just act that way" expression. At the time, I just brushed it off. It bothered me for about 2 seconds in the moment, but even years later I still haven't forgotten. Still, I could tell with that one little moment of ashlery, my friend was not gonna go on a second date with him. Does my first date count? Not too long ago. I was 18 and we went to a small cafe. Not the most glamorous, but he and I had known each other a while, and both agreed we wanted somewhere pretty basic. As we were talking, I noticed this older woman across from us giving us nasty looks. If looks could kill, I would have died 10 years ago, and talking to her husband, who was obviously trying to get her to quiet down. Keep in mind we're 2 guys on a date in the conservative South. Now at this point he hasn't noticed her and I haven't said anything. I get up to use the restroom and this lady gets up and grabs my arm and starts mouthing off about how inappropriate it is to be acting this way with someone of the same sex and spouting off a bunch of Bible thumping garbage. I look at my date and he is super bewildered. The husband grabs his wife's arm and says, "Go get in the goddamned car, we're leaving," and escorts her out the door. The husband actually came back and apologized before offering to cover our bill. We declined but appreciated the gesture. Not a waiter, but I cannot miss the opportunity to share this story. Friend and I meet up at a chain restaurant for a meal and a catch up. In the booth across from us are a guy and a girl in their 20s, very obviously on a date. Things seem to be going moderately well, just kind of let them do their thing in the background as my friend and I chat about life and stuff. Then, guy stands up halfway through the girl's sentence, cutting her off. It's quite a violent standing, so draws the attention of most tables nearby. Guy then says this in a way that makes me think he has rehearsed. "I'm sorry, Jen. I just wanted to give women one more chance, but I can't do it. You're lively, but women just aren't doing it for me." Guy throws some money on the table and walks out. Jen kinda sits there with everyone looking at her, going redder and redder. Lovely waitress swoops in and saves the day for her, but wow. Never seen anything that completely insane before or since. At least just wait for the date to be over and politely decline a second. TLDR. Guy decides he was gay mid hetero date, stands up, Loudly renounces women and leaves his date embarrassed as all hell.